Josh, what is up, man? Welcome to Dad Edge.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Good to be here and very, very excited about the conversation that we're about to have.
Yeah, me too. And I'm really excited that my wife is not a part of this because like I've known my wife for 26 years and she's got this thing for like this UK accent, Scottish accent, Irish accent. So like, she'd be in here, she'd be like, "Oh, who's that?" Like if she could hear you.
It's funny, right? Because I think the opposite's normally true as well, right? Over here in the UK, everybody seems to be taken in by the American accent. So
Which is hilarious because I
maybe
feel like
maybe
go ahead, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say I think it's probably a lot to do with all wanting things that you feel like you can't have, right?
Yeah, maybe. I guess like I always whenever I hear somebody with like a really cool accent, right? Whether they're Irish or from the UK or whatever else, right? It's like, man, we must sound like a bunch of idiots over here. Like, you know what I mean? Like we must just sound like we're dumb. Like, cause you guys sound like very sophisticated, you know what I'm saying?
You know what? You know what? You know what you sound like to me, actually. Not so much now that I've grown into my adulthood, but when I was a kid, American accents made you sound famous to me because when I was a kid, when we first got like satellite TV, where I used to watch Nickelodeon, so all of the things I watched on TV
Yeah.
were American, right? So I sort of connected being American with being like a famous actor on the TV. So Americans always sound like famous actors to me.
That is so I never thought of it like that, I think I think of the UK accent as celebrity now that you mention it because like there's a lot of really big people, a lot of big names in the UK and that kind of thing, especially singers. It's like, and you have no idea where they're from until they start talking. You're like, oh man, like I didn't even know they were from the UK. So, but really cool stuff, man. And well, speaking of your upbringing, you and I were jamming just a little bit before we hit record. You have a pretty interesting background. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so look, I think what's important to kind of say when reflecting on my childhood is that I only really discovered what I'm about to tell you in sort of into my adulthood when I started actively trying to look at the ways that I felt and what that meant. Prior to that, I used to say that I had a pretty average, normal upbringing, right? And I think it's important for me to highlight that because it's actually taken some work for me to be able to see it for what it was for a large part of it. And I grew up with an alcoholic father, so my dad was like quite violent, um,
Like
angry.
physically.
Yeah, I mean, not with me, but there was physical violence. There was a lot of that going on in the home, and I think I lived with two brothers, so I had a brother who's a year and a half younger than me, and one who's a year and a half older, and you spent most of your time upstairs, but there was physical violence, not like I say, not towards me, but like I say to everybody, the domestic violence doesn't have to have been on you for you to say that you experienced it. So yeah, there was a lot of that going on. Um, he was very scary. And then he spent some time in prison, and he when he came out of prison, he had a drug problem too, and he died when I was 9 years old. So I was about 9 years old when my dad passed away. Um, and like by then, my mum had remarried, but what I realized now that I didn't realize then, or so I didn't realize until I started to look at myself, is how scary I found men as a result, as a
Oh,
result of those experiences, particularly strong, loud men. I mean, if I like my mum remarried, right? My stepdad, who she's still with today, who's an incredible man, right? Um, but he's very strong, very kind of I don't know, masculine, whatever terms you want to use for him. And I now recognize how scary I found that when I was a kid, right? Because of my past, not through any fault of my stepdad, right, but through my past experiences. And the next layer of that is that I very purposely, I didn't realize this, but very purposely set about being like that myself. Strong, and I've spent my life wanting to be a man, the idea of a man, which
yeah.
was what my dad was. And I recognize that.
It's really fascinating, man. been doing this mission for 7 years now, and I grew up with these really toxic men in my life. My
Mm.
mom and biological father got divorced when I was like 9 months old, and the funny thing is, I didn't even have a relationship with my biological father till I was 30. I mean, that was by accident.
Wow.
But here's what I'll,
Wow.
yeah, but here's what I'll tell you, just kind of meet you where you're at. My mom married a few times. She married a total of 3 times. There were one or two live-in boyfriends there for a while, not a marriage, but live-in boyfriends. And then there were guys that were constantly in and out dating, And the interesting thing that you just said about masculinity and strength and power, it scared me as well. And I didn't even really understand that until you just started talking about that. And to the point where I associated a strong man with someone who could hurt me. And
Yeah.
and it sounds like you had the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Both consciously to a degree, but also subconsciously. Like I always say, I probably find it hardest to be my kind of authentic self of who I am. I find that hardest when I'm around strong looking men, right? Because what happens is there's a part of me internally that panics, right? That still today, and panic might be too extreme a word in some instances, but I will change the way that I am. I will physically try to show my own strength. I notice when I'm in big groups of men, um, I might swear a bit more and be a little bit more harsh in the way that I am, and pump my chest out, and I don't know, talk about fights that I never had when I was younger and stuff like that, right? And
Yeah.
I noticed that side of me comes out in my life today still, and that's because of the messaging that I received when I was a child, really, of what a man, what a strong man does with his strength.
It's fascinating, man. I just want to acknowledge something here. We're only 7 minutes into this podcast, and you're being your just most authentic self. And so like when I did research on you and I went to your website and I saw some of the things you speak about and the way you speak, I didn't expect you to see this side of you, to be honest. But I like this side because it's the truth, right?
Mm,
And there's a lot of men who are listening to this podcast and perhaps they're feeling the same way to some degree. Maybe they feel it, wholeheartedly when they're around other men, and maybe they're feeling it somewhat, but you're definitely speaking to a lot of guys out there. What have you found over the years just working with men, and perhaps when it comes to maybe true masculinity? Because I think a lot of us just get this confused. I saw this meme on social media said just because you have a beard that doesn't mean you're a man. And I was like, because it's like, you go on social and it's like all these dudes have like these full blown out beards. They're yelling, their messages and that kind of thing. And, they're in your face. But yet, I don't know if that's true masculinity, because in my mind, a true man is and this is to quote Jordan Peterson, a true man is a kind man, a gentleman, but a very dangerous man. Right. So that he can unlock, that danger when he really needs it. Right.
mm,
He doesn't necessarily need to tell people that he's dangerous. He can just be dangerous. Right. But he can also be empathetic and kind and loving and affectionate with his kids, but also be, hey, I'm affectionate. I'm here for you. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to listen to you. However, when it comes down to it, if I need to protect you, oh, I'm going to take a bullet. Right. Those are some of the things that I think true masculinity is all about. But what do you think?
I mean, I'd certainly fall in line with all of the things that you've just said. And I guess what I would say, look, ultimately at the core, I think it's the ability to be every part of myself in a way that makes me and the people that I care about feel safe. So if I be that kind of strong version of myself that I know that I can be when it's needed, if I'm being that for every emotion that my children show, then I'm not in control. Do you know what I mean? I'm not being with them. I'm not making them feel safe in, I don't know, an emotionally vulnerable moment. And so I think that's, you know, the ability to make myself feel safe so that I can co-regulate with the people that I care about in the way that they need. I guess that would be the answer. But I would also add to that I don't think it's always easy. I don't think it's always easy. And I think we have to be way more compassionate for ourselves in the moments when it's not easy. Because I know, like, look, I know I'm very good at talking about what I think is right and what I think should be the way that we should be. I'm particularly good at portraying that in the moments when I need to in the work that I do. But what's important is how willing I am to show up to who I am in every aspect of my life. In the moments when I'm alone with my children and perhaps I'm not being the dad that I want to be or should be. And how do I show up in those moments? How do I show up for myself in those moments to understand that I'm a human being, and in that moment I might have not been what I wanted to be, and see that truly, and see it for what it is, and change? Because not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I sometimes will shout at my children, right? And I don't want to shout at my children as a dad, but sometimes it happens. And in the past, I can be around other men and say things like, "Well, I sometimes shout at my kids, and I do that because I don't want them to turn out like me," right? And you can say that in a group of dads, and they'll all agree, right? But actually, the truth is that that's not the truth. I don't shout at my kids because I don't want them to turn out like me. I shout at my kids because in that moment I was unable to feel safe enough to stay in myself and be what I needed to be in that moment, right? I've never once gone away and calmly thought to myself, I'm going to go back and try shouting at him and see if that works, right? I've never done that. It's when I've become completely or unregulated in that moment. So it's about me.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, man, to come back to the question, it's in those moments. Can I see myself, my true self, and be comfortable enough with how I've shown up in that moment to want to move towards doing it right?
Mm-hmm. It's so fascinating, man. I've heard this quote, and it was from a parenting expert came on the podcast, and he said, do you really want to understand what losing your patience is all about? And I like zoomed in. I'm like, yeah, man, please tell me, like, what is that all about? Because we do it all the time, as parents, right? It's not just dads, it's moms too. He's like, when you have lost your patience, you've reached the limit of your skill set and you just don't know what to do. And I
Yeah.
don't know what it was about hearing that, but it was just like, holy crap, that is absolutely true. Because you're right. It's not necessarily about the kid at all, really. It's, I don't know what to do next. And what's happening externally with this kid, I might be very triggered by the way they're acting, behaving. Maybe they lied to me or whatever else. I'm upset. But what's happening internally is I don't know what to do now. And now not only am I upset, but now I'm very frustrated. And then it comes out in yelling, right? Or getting really, really upset. Just quick story for you. And this is, been doing this movement. Like I actually have a course, a masterclass on patience and emotional resiliency, and like literally how to tap into it. Here's the funny thing though, and I'm very honest with the audience, right? I'm like, hey, my batting average is pretty good, like maybe 6, 7 out of 10 times I do all right, and then there's those 3 or 4 times I fall flat, just flat on my face. And my 14-year-old, you have teenagers, I have teenagers. My 14-year-old, this was just a couple months ago. He kind of does this thing where he leaves his trash behind and his dishes and his Gatorade bottles and like just stuff, right? And shoes everywhere. And like, it just drives me crazy, man, because like the story that I tell myself, and I know that this is not true, is he's not considerate. He's not being respectful. He assumes someone's going to come up behind him and clean up after him. And I don't like that. And in all reality, he just forgot it was there. Right. Or
Yeah.
he's a teenager. And so I went downstairs, man. And it was one of those days, it wasn't about him. It was about me. And I was triggered. I'd had a bad day or something like that. And I see his Gatorade bottles and his popcorn bowls and his popcorn bags and trash and shoes. And I'm like, ugh. And I bring him out and I'm like, dude, what is this, man? Come on. How many times have we talked about it? And I'm like yelling at him. Right. And here's the funny thing. This is when you see your 14-year-old go to a 30-year-old, right? And he just looked at me and just took it. And I was just like, losing it. I was just falling flat on my face. And he looked at me, he goes, Dad, he goes, I'm sorry. He goes, I honestly forgot. He goes, I have been a lot better about this. You know, I know that you don't like this. He goes, but you don't have to yell at me. And he just said it very calm. And I'm like, well, if you just pick, and then my ego steps in. Well, if you picked it up, I wouldn't have to yell. And I knew as those words were coming out, I was like, this is such BS. Like, this is dumb, right? I knew I was being dumb, but I was like, it was almost like the words were out there and I couldn't stop it. I was like, trying to get them back in. And I just kept going. And then he's just like, yeah, but you don't have to yell at me. He's like, if you ask, he's like, listen, I will do my part and I will definitely clean up after myself. But if you see something, he's like, would you mind just maybe asking me nicely? And I'll do it. I promise. And I walked away, you know, my ego. And I was like, my God, that kid is so right. The kid is so right. What am I teaching this kid? Like, am I teaching this kid to like lose his mind? Like, so I went back downstairs. It only took about 6 or 7 minutes. And I'm like, you are like, listen, we both know you leaving your trash out is not right. He's like, yeah, I get that. I was like, how I reacted though, that was wrong. You're absolutely right. You're a human being. And I can speak to you like a human being. I don't have to speak to you like that. And this is a great lesson for both of us that when you get upset or triggered, you can go calm, right? And I told him, and we hugged it out and everything. I was like, listen, Mason, I was like, you know how you're trying to figure out how to be a freshman in high school, trying to figure out how to be 14, trying to figure out how to play for your high school football team, trying to figure out girls and friends. He's like, yeah. I was like, well, I'm still trying to figure out how to be 46. And I'm still trying to figure out how to raise 4 boys. And some days I get it right. And some days I fall flat on my face. And I appreciate you giving me grace because I fell on my face today. And it's realizing in those moments that I have run out of the skill or I'm triggered and it really doesn't have much to do with him. It has more to do with me. But I love how you said that. And like, we call that zooming out from the situation to where like you almost see things unfold and you know they're not right. But you have how many kids?
I've got 6 kids.
Right. 6 kids. I would love for you to, man, you know, share some stories on how this has maybe shown up for you. And maybe, you know, maybe some times that maybe you're not necessarily proud of, but maybe some times also that you've recovered really, really well.
Look, I get asked quite often about like parenting advice, yeah. And I mean, what you've just described is always the advice that I give people. I say, look, if you want to be a good parent, just learn to revisit, right? Learn to revisit because you're going to need to do it a lot. And I think that's true. But one thing springs to mind with me. I have a son who's 11 now. So, and he's very like I was. I've always been really sensitive, right? By sensitive, I mean I get overwhelmed very, very quickly. I'm very in tune with things and what's going on. I'm in tune with people's emotions and their feelings, right? And that's hard work when you're a child. I remember it being hard work. I remember being in tune with my mum and my dad and their energy and what they were experiencing. And I remember feeling like I was crazy because my mum and my dad didn't have the ability to validate what I was when I was right, you know. And so you know, as a kid, I used to find myself, you know, when I was scared, there was nothing to be scared of. When I was sad, people over the other side of the world had it way worse than me, and I should stop whining, like all of that kind of stuff. And so when nobody's talking about stuff that's going on and that you're sensing and picking up on as a child, right, you find yourself often sat on your own, thinking to yourself, like, what's wrong with me? Like I could have sworn that dad was angry. I could have sworn something was going on downstairs, and they're telling me everything's fine, right? And so I know my son's like that. I know the antidote to that because I tell people this all the time. The antidote to that is to help them comprehend their experience, to be with them, to come in and say, what you're experiencing makes sense, right? Yes, I was stressed yesterday and you were picking up on it and you didn't know how to deal with that energy in that moment. And I should have helped you and I didn't, and stuff like that, right? Revisiting in the way that you just said. But I remember my relationship with my son. He lives with me now, but at the time he wasn't living with me, and my relationship with him was very strained. And I remember saying to my wife, "I don't know what I'm going to do about him. I don't know what to do about my son." And my wife said, "You need to realize he's not the problem. You are." And of course, at first, when she said it, I was like, who do you like? You got no idea. But then quickly I realized she was right. And what was happening is that I was approaching my son with, with my guard up, metaphorically, my fists in front of my face to protect myself, worried about what part of myself he was going to expose next. And so because he was so much like me, um, he pulled down all the barriers and the defenses that I had built up against my own sensitivity. He pulled them down because he needed me to step into his sensitivity and help him comprehend it. And I had built up walls. And so what I had to slowly do was pull my own walls down and realize my son isn't too sensitive. What I meant when I felt that was that I couldn't handle how I felt when I sensed his sensitivity. And that was about me. And so our relationship changed dramatically from that moment as I began to work on myself. How do I be with my son? How do I relearn how I deal with my own sensitivity so that I can be with my son? Um, and this comes, full circle, because the way I learned is to revisit. It's because at first I kept shaming myself. I did it again. My son came to me yesterday and I fobbed him off. I told him to stop being silly and not worry about it. And I knew that that was the wrong thing. And I used to shame myself. When will you get to the point when you can be available for your son? And what I realized is that over time, I can be there more and more for him. And I think, by the time I'm 60, I'll probably be able to be there with him all of the time, right? But I ain't there yet. And being able to revisit, like you said, being able to come back, say to my son, I'm sorry about yesterday. Here's why I was like that. And here's what I'm going to do about it. And I want to give you the opportunity to ask, to tell me if there's anything I can do in this moment to support that.
You know what's so cool about that, man? First of all, I love that story. And, I think a lot of us were raised with the opposite. I know I was. I remember
Mm-hmm.
hearing the message, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm the mom, you're the kid. Never forget that. Right. Which basically
Yeah.
means you're never right. Even if I'm wrong, you're wrong. There were times, man, where like, I remember growing up and my mom would be hammered ass drunk, with whoever guy she was dating or married to or whatever. And they would just rail me and yell at me. And I mean, call me names and call each other names and, wake up the next morning and I'd be like, hey, like this happened. And they're like, well, yeah, it's your fault. And I'm like, and I remember being a little kid or even a teenager, I'd be like, I know that this is not my fault. But yet when you're a kid and you're told that, there's a big part of you that believes that. You're like, wow,
Mm.
I guess maybe it was me, And then now I look back on it, I'm like, man, it was not. Like, who is the adult there, right? But
Mm.
here's the cool thing. I've apologized also to my kids more than I can count. But here's the cool thing. And I think a lot of fathers who were raised in that environment of like, I always have to save face. Even if I'm wrong, I have to make it look like I'm right because I have to make it look
Mm.
like I know what I'm doing. Otherwise, I'm going to lose credibility with these kids. I would argue it's the opposite. I would argue
Mm.
that your kids will respect you more and give you more credibility if they see that human side of you. And here's the other thing too. Best lessons in life, man, are caught, not taught. And here's a perfect example. I would guarantee that your kids, right? And if you've had those situations with your kids, right? What is happening in that moment is, oh my gosh, my dad's a human being. Oh my gosh, I have so much more respect for my dad now that he's owning his mistakes. And here's the other cool thing. When they are in that situation where they're acting out or they're losing their cool or they're whatever, they remember, wait a second, this wasn't right. I remember my dad owning this, which gives them more emotional intelligence, right? And
Mm.
the cool thing I've seen with my oldest boys, and they're not perfect by any means or anything like that, but there's one beautiful characteristic trait that I've seen in them is, especially if they've gotten older, full on ownership. Like it almost
Mm.
shocks me. Like I almost like when they're in trouble, I almost wait for them to give me excuses or to give me like, oh, it wasn't my fault or it wasn't this or wasn't that. And they will, for the majority of the time, they'll be like, yep, that was all me. I totally did that. And there's a part of me who's like, wow, I didn't expect that. And they will full on apologize too. So I think how you're raising your kids, right? Especially with that lesson right there, you're teaching them that, right? And
Mm,
sometimes, but you're not teaching them in a way like, hey, this is how you should operate. You're teaching them by showing them, which is super
yeah,
cool.
yeah. And I think as well, when kids are really young, I think they see truth, right? I think they see truth. And I think unless you help them comprehend that truth, then they'll make a story up, right? And when these young kids make stories up, children, up to a certain age, for sure, are egocentric. So that story will be about themselves, And so, I think children are just crying out for the truth all of the time. They just want the truth so they can make sense of their experience. And when you give them the truth, they know what to do with it because it's the truth,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And this leans into what you just said, because I get people, I do a lot of work. I support a charity that supports children affected by parents drinking, and
Really?
I have,
That's awesome.
yeah, and I have people come to me all the time and say, um, should I tell the kids? And I'm like, they already know. They already know. You need to help them comprehend what's going on. Don't push it under the carpet. I didn't realize, but I spent my whole life waiting for somebody to tell me the truth of what I was experiencing. I walked into the charity is NACOA, the National Association for Children of Alcoholics, right? I've been an ambassador for them for years now. I found them when I was like 25 years old. And I walked in, and when they told me all the attributes of somebody that's been, raised by an alcoholic parent, every single one of them was me. And until somebody showed me that, I thought there was something wrong with me. I spent my life thinking there's something wrong with me. Why am I like this? And when somebody helps me, gives me the truth, yeah, that doesn't take my power away. That gives me my power back, because that says you're not broken. You're not something that needs fixing. You've been reacting to the world the best way that you know how. And that's why another thing that I try and teach all of my children, or try and do for my children, is to help them comprehend what they're experiencing, to listen to them so that they can get to explore and find out their truth, right? Because this game of life that I've played so far, every dark moment I have has been because I'm lost and I need to get back to the truth. And so if we can help our children be in the truth, like you've talked that your sons are, right? You got, as a parent, right? You have nowhere to go when your kids give you the truth. It doesn't matter what they've done. You've nowhere to go. If you
So
say,
true.
who did this? If I say to my kids, who did this? And one of my kids goes, that was me. I go, all right. Why did you do it? Well, I was being stupid, right? And I'm sorry. The game's over for me. There's no argument. There's like, okay, I might tell them we don't like that in this house, and there might be a consequence or whatever, but there's nowhere else to go because we're at the truth. So I don't know who it was that said the truth will set you free, but they were right. I think it might have been Jesus, apparently. I don't know.
I think you're right, man. But I think at the end of the day, that's what we truly want is full on ownership. Yeah, I really love to get to marriage. You before we hit the record button, you speak very highly of your wife. And I know relationships over the years for you haven't been easy. And by the way, I feel you on that. I think if you've been raised by an alcoholic, abusive parent, relationships just inherently are not going to be easy because I think
Mm,
there's a trust factor. I think there's a lot of things going on. There's trust factors going on. Like, how, can I fully trust the person I'm with? I also think if you've seen or been raised by a toxic parent with maybe substance, there's a part of us that for some crazy reason we seek out a toxic relationship in our own life. And
hmm
and just a quick kind of reflection of my own, I don't know if this aligns with what you've experienced personally. I dated a lot of women before I dated my wife. And I dated my wife for 7 years. And it became like this joke because like all of her friends were getting married and like, all her friends were like, hello, are you ever going to propose? Like, and my mind was, here's the crazy thing about my reality when it came to marriage in my late teens, early 20s. Marriage is the first step to divorce. I remember saying that crazy crap to my now wife. Like, well, marriage is the first step to divorce. There was a part of me because I saw so many men in and out, my mom in so many relationships, that I just thought that that's what marriage was, and that's is what it is, you know. But and I would seek out relationships that I knew were like, well, I know this is going to end soon, or I know that this is going to be toxic. It just is what it is, but whatever. I guess it's kind of fun or whatever. And then but there was a part of me, and this is where I get a little deeper on it, because looking back now, I could detach from it. Like that girl could leave me, and I'd be like, well, she was a pain in the ass anyway, or our relationship wasn't that great, or whatever. Like, fine. Then I met my wife, and man, I was like, this woman is awesome. This woman's a good woman. This woman, this is too good to be true. And there was a part of me that just doubted it. And it became a joke. I broke up with my wife every year, 7 years in a row, once a year. And it became like, okay, yeah, you're breaking up
Wow.
again. This is great. Right. And I didn't know why at the time I was doing it. Well, now here's what I can definitely tell you, 20 years later, we've been married 19 years. I loved her so much that, and I cared about her, and I knew that she was good for me. And that scared me, because I knew that this woman, if this ends, this one will really get me. This one will kill me if this one ends. So I detached from it. It was almost like this fear of abandonment where I would leave her first before she had a chance to leave me. And I know that now. That was the way I was operating, which was very dysfunctional. But that's what I saw growing up too. So I've learned a lot about marriage, but that's one big reflection of like, wow, that's how I was operating. I didn't even know it. But for you, I know you were married once before. You're happily married now, 6 kids, but there's been some big lessons you've learned over the past, 16 years.
Yeah, I mean, look, on this front, where do you start? Look, what I would say is the trauma plays out in our relationships, right? Trauma itself is the wound of the way in which I connect to myself and other people, right? So I think as people try and, you see people do a lot of like vulnerable sharing online, and even in this setting, right? We're being vulnerable with one another. It's still a whole different ball game when I go and be vulnerable with somebody that I care about, particularly with my wife. Yeah. Because that's where all my wounding is. Yeah. And what's my core wound? In and of myself, I'm not lovable. So I showed up to relationships in the past where I worked out who they wanted me to be, and I became that, whatever it was, no matter how much at the expense of myself it was. That's what I did. And so I ended up in these relationships that were highly dysfunctional, where I felt like I'd have to work really hard and all of that kind of stuff, because that was my attachment when I was a child, right? But then I come to my marriage today with my wife today, and I think it's a bit like you, right? In the way that you talked, when you know that this is a good woman, right? This is everything about this is right for me, right? I think if you grew up in chaos with abandonment at the core of that, right? For people like me, and it sounds like for you, anxiety and worry and concern comes not in the chaos. It comes when everything's just as it should be, because that's when we're waiting. When's dad going to drink again, right? And if I'm not careful, I'll spend my time in relationships when everything's really good. I start panicking, and me and my wife, at the beginning of our relationship, we would have like a disagreement about something, and then straight away I'd be going, "You're going to leave, aren't you?" And like Leah, my wife, would be like, "Why would I leave? Like, we've fallen out about, I don't know, there'd been no milk in the fridge. Why would I leave you?" And like, I was just so, that's why you of course you would. Why would you not? Why would you, if I can't make you 100% happy all of the time, why would you even be here? Yeah. And so what happens is that uh I end up building in these barriers and these defenses, a bit like you. I mean, I never like left my wife regularly. We got married after a couple of years, like very quickly. But if I'm not careful, I build those barriers, right? And I have to. Just last night, right? I was feeling overwhelmed yesterday, and I was experiencing quite a bit of like that overwhelm where my nervous system's quite like dysregulated. And I'm in an amazing place in my marriage now where I can communicate that to my wife, you know, where I say to my wife, here's what I'm feeling, here's where I'm at. You go back a few years, I wouldn't have said that. And I wouldn't have said it because of all of the fear, you know, she won't think I'm strong and she won't love me. She'll think I'm crazy and I need her to love me and I need to be this perfect idea of what I am. And of course, that's not true. It's not who I am. And so I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit here, but being able to be my whole self with her, with my wife today, is an experience that I've never had really. And because I've been doing it for a longer, you know, quite a while now with my wife, it's less scary. But at the beginning, you know, when you give everything to somebody, there's huge risk because they might drop it, you know.
Yeah.
And when you've lived a life when everybody else has dropped it, then you know, of course you're scared of that. Makes sense.
You and I must be cut from a very similar cloth because we've had very similar conversations with our wives. And that is,
Yeah.
and sometimes I'll even say this, and I think it comes from like an upbringing of unpredictability and maybe not safety and like what am I going to walk in on type thing. Like um I remember coming home from high school or, you know, on a Friday night, you know, like being out with friends or like even coming home from college to visit home. And I remember, or like at holidays, you know, with my wife, we were either early in our marriage or it was before we were married. And I remember sitting in my driveway, you know, it could have been like dinner on a Sunday, could have been Christmas, Thanksgiving, or I'm just coming home on a Friday or whatever. I remember sitting in my driveway thinking to myself, so much anxiety. What am I going to walk in on tonight? Because it was a dice
Mm-hmm.
roll. It was a dice roll, like of, am I going to get Jekyll? Am I going to get Hyde? What am I walking? Are they going to be fighting? Are they going to be drunk? Are they going to be whatever? And it was always a dice roll. There was never that predictability. And I've noticed, even as you talk about what you just talked about, which is when things are really good, when you've been raised like that, you're like, what's around the corner? Like,
Mm.
this can't be as good as I think it is because something's got to be lurking, right? And that's what I've noticed about even in my adulthood. There are times, even still, where things are going freaking fantastic, you know, with me and my wife and the boys, and we're in a season of just like positivity. And my wife will be like, "Man, isn't this awesome?" I'm like, "Yeah, I wonder what's around the corner." And she'll look at me and be
Yeah.
like, why do you think like that?" And I'm like, "I don't know, because that's the way life is kind of rolled." And the same thing, like wife and I will get into an argument. And here's the thing, and this is, I say this humbly. I know I'm a good guy and I know I love her very, very well. And I know that I'm good for her and I know she's good for me. But dude, there's still that part of me that sometimes if things go a little south or we get into a little tiff or whatever, I'll look at her and be like, "You're not going to leave me, are you?" And she'll look at me like, "What?" Like literally just blown away. She'll be like, "Why would you even ask that? Like, for God's sake, come on. Like, I am here to stay forever. Like, you'd have to really try to get rid of me." But there's still that part of me like, well, could she? Will she?
Mm.
I don't even know where that really comes from, but it's fascinating that you've experienced the same. You know, if you could look at your relationship now and really identify the things that make you guys work like really well, what are some of those identifiers?
In some ways, you know, I think if you think of the way, like I'm gonna try and describe, I don't know why this is coming in my head, but you know, like with the way that your hands come together when your fingers clasp together like that, they fit, right? Because there's almost like there's opposites here. Where there's a finger, there's a space, and so it goes in, right? And like as much as I'm very deep and in my emotions all of the time and all of that kind of stuff, my wife, you know, is quite strong and firm and knows she knows how to she can literally be the one that says to me, come on now, we need you, I need you back, that's it, now you've done this now. And there's something so strong and stern in the gentle way that she's able to do that for me. right? And we we always communicate. You know, I mean, look, I get it, what I would say is a very simple level is my life today is about my kids and my wife. That's the core. That, you know, that's what comes before anything. And if I'm going to do something, it best fit in with that. And if it doesn't, then I won't do it. And we're both very much like that. We're both, all the experiences that I've had in the past have led me to be like that. She's taught me also, let me say that too. Yeah. She's taught me also, her and her parents have taught me that you can be part of a loving system and mess up and still be part of the system, you know. And when things go bad, or when things, you know, when we struggle with stuff, eventually at least we come together and we sort it out. We sort it out, and we know each other. We know each other to the core, really. So I don't know how much that answers the question, but I always say my wife's the glue here. My wife's the one that holds us together, holds it all together. Uh, I don't know whether that's the right way to be, but that's the truth.
Dude, that's very well said. I think you and I could like literally sit down. Maybe we're married to the same type of women. I'm not really sure. But it sounds like your relationship really serves you, and it sounds like you really serve her. And you know, we're the same. You know, I've noticed that let me throw some other things out here about marriage. And I just want to get your take on it. I think there are there are ways that and I think we just don't know any better, to be honest, right? I mean,
Mm,
if you think of I use this terminology and these analogies and comparisons a lot, but if you really think about marriage and parenting, let's just take those two areas of our lives, marriage and parenting, right? You're thrusted into these things, and society and the world has this expectation of like, oh, don't worry, you'll figure it out. Best time of your whole life. Like I remember even being told that when I had my first kid. I'm like, wait a second. And if you really think about this, there's no other area in our life that that's acceptable. Like last time I
yeah.
saw, you know, if you go into mechanical engineering, you have to go get a degree in that and go be trained on that. No firm is going to hire you, be like, oh, today you're a mechanical engineer, you're going to start building all these different things and do all this other stuff. And of course you're gonna be like, well, I don't know how to do that. Oh, don't worry, you'll figure it out. Best time of your whole life. Like you're not going to get a job, and you certainly aren't going to do a good project, right? And same thing with a cop, firefighter, surgeons, teachers, in any area of our lives. That is not acceptable. But yet somehow, some
Mm,
way, in marriage and parenting, oh, don't worry, you'll figure it out. Best time of your whole life. And then here's the other thing too. A lot of us are raised like you and I were probably raised the same. I'm like, okay, I had a laundry list, man, of like things I knew I wouldn't do. I'm like, okay, I know I'm not going to get drunk and yell obscenities at my kids. I'm not going to throw beer bottles at them. I'm not going to slap them, hit them. I'm not going to call them names. I know I'm not going to do all these things, right? And I had a laundry list of things of like, okay, well, I'm going to be a good dad because I know I'm not going to do these things. Well, what I've learned over the years is that is not even close to being enough, because the last time I went to Home Depot or Lowe's and I got a barbecue pit, I opened up the instruction manual. It didn't tell me, oh, congratulations, you got your barbecue pit. Here's 100 ways not to put this thing together, but best of luck. You'll figure it out. Best time of your whole life. There's 67 nuts and bolts and screws and everything else. You'll figure it out. That it doesn't even happen with instructions. So here's what I've noticed. People enter into marriage and they're like, I'll figure it out. Well, if I love her, that's enough. And if she loves me, that's enough. That's not true. There are skills that you absolutely have to learn. Like men and women communicate differently, right? If she's
mm,
venting to you, it's not because she wants you to fix her problems. She wants to connect with you. Well, a lot of guys are like, well, I need to take away her pain and I need to fix her problems. So that's the way we communicate. And then resentment builds up. We also never really fully communicate like, hey, what's my role in this and what's your role? Like, right. And then how do we communicate with it? Like, what are the guardrails we have when we have disagreements? Like my wife and I, guardrails we've had for 26 years is we never, ever, ever, ever call each other a name, ever. We never raise our voice when we argue. We actually speak just like this. We don't go
mm,
below, we don't hit below the belt and go for the jugular. So like if there was a wrongdoing that was done 10 years ago, one of the rules is I don't bring that up. That was in the past. And be like, oh, you remember that time you did that thing? We don't do that. But a lot of couples make, I think, what I would like to call rookie mistakes. And it builds these walls of just resentment over the years. Right. And then people somehow get very, very disconnected over time. We start looking at each other like, oh, she's the old bag, my old lady. Well, he's useless. He just sits on the couch. And like, it turns into that. And I don't think it has to be that way. I think as long as both parties, the man and the woman, are like, hey, I'm here to grow with you. And
Mm,
when times get tough and we can't figure it out, we're going to go figure this out together, whether that be a coach, counselor, book, pastor, whatever it takes, we're going to go figure it out. But I think a lot of people miss that. But what are some things for you that you've noticed working with men, your own relationship, that those are really common mistakes that we all see, and how you've seen other people and yourself just overcome those things?
look, so much of that I think comes back to that. First, the willingness to explore it, right? Because I think so many men, particularly men, but I think it's true for women as well. But when we were young boys, we were taught to push our feelings and our emotions down, right? You're sort of taught to toughen up, to be strong, to not, to go through stuff and to get through it, find a way to get through it. And like you say, I think if you approach anything not willing or able to look at what the problem is, then you're never ever going to be able to find a solution. And so that communication, firstly with yourself, right, to be able to say, because I think if I use my own example, antidote as a way of highlighting what I'm trying to say here, my wife has always been very good at communicating how she feels, regardless of what it is. Yeah. If I do something that makes her feel uncomfortable, then she will bring it up and say, don't do that, I don't like it. And then we have a conversation and we get to work through it. In the past, if my wife does something that makes me feel uncomfortable, I don't know how to say it without thinking that I'm being horrible or she's not going to love me. So I just don't say it. And then 6 weeks later, when there's no milk in the fridge and I'm going crazy, and my wife's like, why are you upset about milk? Right. And then I say, 6 weeks ago, you did this, right? That's like what you're saying, how resentment builds. So much like the work that I do on myself, it comes back to a willingness, a desire, and a want to be able to go further, to question it, to evolve, and to grow. And so, like you just said, in a marriage, it's about doing that in unison and doing that together. But I think so often what I see with the men or anybody that I work with is that they do the opposite to that. And that's when that apathy comes in. Apathy comes in when you start to lose control of how much stuff you've pushed down. And then you can't make sense of any of it. And then your marriage doesn't make sense. You don't make sense. You don't know who you are. I think we lose so many men because they don't know who they are. Yeah. And I actually think, and this is a slightly different subject, but it's linked to what we're saying here about understanding who we are and being able to communicate that, right? I think a lot of men do what I did when I got to manhood, right? When I got to my adulthood, which was like become this version of myself that I'm not. Yeah. And I think a lot of men do that. They get married, they have a couple of kids, right? And they get to about 30, 35. And I don't know if you say this term over in America, but here we say midlife crisis, when actually is what's happening in a midlife crisis is somebody's reached a stage of their life where they can't keep the act up anymore. Now that happened to me, was forced on me early because of the experiences that I had. But if that happened to me, hypothetically speaking, in the marriage that I'm in now, then what do? I've got a wife who I think loves a version of myself that I'm not. I've got two kids who think their dad is something that I'm not. And I think a lot of men leave this world off the back of that. And the saddest thing about that, I believe, is that in so many of those instances, the man has no idea that their wife knows and married the real version of them anyway, because she saw it. And that's why she's there. And so that inability to be who we are and be able to communicate that to the people that we love, I think is at the core of not just marriage problems, but so many of the kind of emotional struggles that we
Mm.
see in men, you know?
I
I don't know if
totally,
that's made sense, if I've said that.
no, it made total sense. If I really think about, and yeah, we use that term midlife crisis a lot. I think you reach a point where, I remember being in my late 20s and 30s when I was, a young father and husband, and you just sort of feel like you have to keep up this persona. I remember, like,
Mm,
you know what I mean? It's like people ask you how life is going, sometimes, and it could be like freaking mad chaos. You're like, oh, I'm good, fine, busy, crew, we're good. Yep.
mm,
It's almost like I want to portray to the world and even my wife and kids that we got it all handled and we got it all together, and that's the way life is. And all the while, in the background, holy crap, like I feel really unprepared for all of this, right? And then there's chaos going on in some way, shape, or form. There are some good things, right? It's not all bad, but there are some things that I remember reaching into my 40s and now where I am now. And I'm not saying I know everything, but I am so much more clear and real and authentic than I ever was in my 30s.
mm,
Like if you ask me what's going on now, dude, I'll be the first to tell you when things are good, and I'll be the first to tell you now, like this is a freaking mess right now. It's crazy,
mm.
right? And what I've noticed with that authenticity is that people like me more, and I can relate to people more because it's real, and I think right in line with that midlife crisis, it's like once you realize you're like, wow, like I don't really have to keep up this act. Like I'm actually a human being, and it's really okay to be a human being, and
Mm,
I think you just reach a point where you just sort of, I hear this from Garrett White a lot from Wake Up Warrior. Tell the truth. You just tell the truth, for
mm.
whatever it is. If when things are good, hey, they're good. When things are not so good, they're not so good. But it just is what it is. And if you don't know, you just don't know.
Yeah.
And I think men miss that when they're maybe in their
Mm.
younger years of like, hey, you can be your most authentic self with your wife and your kids, and they're probably going to love you even more.
Yeah, and you know what? Gabor Mate.
Mhm.
You familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate's work?
No, no, but now I'm
Right.
going to Google them.
So you have to Google him, and I mean, if you can get him on here, he'll be amazing for you. Let me tell you something that he says, and I think this is important, right? Children, children need two core things, right? When they're first born, the first thing that they need is attachment to their parents or primary caregivers, right? From an evolutionary point of view, we wouldn't survive if we didn't attach to our parents, right? It's a biological need because when we're born, right, we are completely dependent on our parents, more so than in most other animals in the animal kingdom, by the way. Yeah. If you think of a horse or a cow, when it's born, it can walk straight away because the brain develops on the inside. When we went up onto two legs and the hips narrowed, you couldn't get a fully formed brain out. So we do a lot of our brain development on the outside, right? So we it's a biological need to attach to our parents, right? It's not a desire or a want. We're wired to do that, right? The second thing that children need is authenticity. Now, authenticity, when we talk about it, at its core, is these three key simple things, right? Understanding what I'm feeling, knowing what I need as a result of that feeling, and then knowing how to communicate that need within my relationships and my activities. So every baby that's born, or most of them anyway, are completely authentic. When they want something, they cry and then they get what they need, right? You'll know as a parent, when your kids cried in those initial years, it wasn't just a noise, it had a physical impact on you to motivate you to give them what they need, right? So they need the attachment and they need the authenticity. I think the problems for most of us arise when we're children, and that authenticity threatens the attachment to our parents or primary caregivers. It's the authenticity that loses out every time, right? In simple terms, right? If I think that by being myself, I won't get the love of my mum and dad, then I won't be myself. And so we learn and we become a distorted version of who we are when we're children in order to get the love of our parents. And so that attachment's threatened all the time. If my mum is wrapped up in my dad's drinking, then I can't be my emotional self. I need to push my emotions down. And then we get these messages about ourselves and we disconnect from ourselves and we lose what I think is the key part that we all need to find again in our adulthood, which is curiosity. So when somebody says to me, "How are you feeling?" I don't go, "Let me give the answer that I think this guy wants to hear from me." I become curious. How am I feeling? I don't know. How am I feeling? Well, I mean, I've got some stuff going on at the moment, so I'm a little bit overwhelmed, if I'm honest with you. Right, that curiosity will always lead to the answer, but curiosity is frightening when the answer that it leads to is one that makes you feel unsafe when you're a child.
Amen to that. I totally agree with all of that. I want to put you in two situations as we wrap up here. I want you, so you're 35, is that correct?
35, yeah.
35. Okay. So here's the first question. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's
Okay.
do it.
So I want you to imagine for a moment that you have a time machine and
Mhm.
you pick up the phone and you call yourself at 19 years old. So you're 35 now, you call your 19-year-old self and you're like, hey, Josh, this is me from the future. I'm 35 years old. I'm going to come back in time. I'm going to take you out to dinner for 1 hour. I want to sit you down and I want to give you advice that's really going to serve you over the next 15 years, 16 years. So I'll be right there. Hang up the phone. You rip a hole in the space time continuum. You go back in time. You take yourself out to dinner. You're literally looking across the table. You're at your 19-year-old self, and you now have an opportunity to give yourself some advice about the future. What would you be telling yourself?
19-year-old me was heavily into drinking and drugs. So the first thing I would say is thank you for finding a way to keep me alive this long. Right. That would be the first thing that I would say. And then the next thing that I would say to them is that if you can find the strength and the courage to look within yourself and try and make sense of the ways that you feel, what you'll find is that everything that you're experiencing makes a lot of sense. And once you're able to make sense of your pain, you'll find an incredible amount of power in your life to understand the changes that you can make. And I would encourage the 19-year-old me to go on that journey of becoming curious about those things and exploring them. But not to be too cheesy, what I wouldn't do is rob 19-year-old me of the experience of searching for and making sense of their pain, because it's been a hell of a ride.
You know what's really cool, man, is you started that with gratitude. I've asked that question of a few people here and there, and it's never started with gratitude. It always dove straight into advice. And it was always like, but I love that you started with gratitude. And then you also incorporated, still going through some pain, not necessarily avoiding it, going through it and understanding it to evolve, right? Even faster.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, man.
That's cool advice because you wouldn't get where you're at today without going through some of those hardships. Uh, Last question I have for you is a bit different. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're 55. Your 16-year-old is now your age, right? And I'm not sure how old the rest of your kids are, but think about all of your kids 20 years down the road. And you've been married to your wife for another 20 years, 55 years old. You're sitting at the dinner table. You're at the head of the table. Your wife is to your right. You hold her hand. Your oldest, who's 16, is now 36, is to your left. You hold boy. Is that right?
My eldest is a girl.
Girl. Okay. So you hold her hand. And then the entire family holds hands. And you look at everybody and you're just in awe. And you just have gratitude. But you look at them and you ask all of them a question. And here's the question: what are the things that have brought us the most amount of connection, your greatest memories that you just absolutely love that we've created over the past 20 years? What are they telling you that's happened that hasn't happened yet?
In the next 20 years.
Yeah. Things that have happened
Um,
that haven't happened yet.
uh, the thing that comes to my mind, I'll be completely candid and just go with the first thing that comes to my mind. Particularly my four children from my previous marriage. Uh, there is an incredibly difficult and messy relationship between me and their mum. And what's happened in the next 20 years is that not just between me and their mum, by the way, but between some of them and their mum. And what's happened in the next 20 years is that that has been somehow reconciled in some way, and all of the kids are at peace with that. Well, let me be clear about the way that I see it being reconciled. For each of them, it's reconciled in the way that works for them. It doesn't necessarily have to be that that relationship has been completely rebuilt and is now harmonious, but they have a level of peace over wherever that relationship is. That would be the thing that I would really want, for my other four kids. My two youngest, honestly, I don't want to be too cheesy, but like, if if my life continued in the same vein as it is now, but up until when I was 25 years old, I'd be a very proud man. But they didn't get the worst of me. My two youngest, the reason they're separate is because they didn't get the worst of me. I've been sober. They've only ever known me as a sober and on a very clear healing journey. So that's why it's slightly different for the two lots of children.
That's cool, man. And what about your wife? What is she celebrating with you?
She's celebrating putting up with me for 20 more years. No, do you know what she said? Do you know what my wife would be celebrating? My wife wants what her mum and dad have, yeah, which is, if I got off this call now and decided that I was too overwhelmed and I felt crap, I could get in my car and go to my mother and father-in-law's, and within a couple of seconds of being there, there'd be some food on the table and everything would be forgotten and it'd be all right. And if we've got that, me and my wife, in 20 years for our kids, then we'll both be very happy.
Sounds like you and I are married to a very similar woman, and we have very similar in-laws. So mine are the exact same. So they've been married for 40 plus years. Just really fantastic family. Safe house to be in. Where when things go wrong, you can go there. So, man, this is so cool.
Wow.
I want to make sure as we wrap up here that all the men can find the really cool work you're doing, and where they can connect with you. So, what is the best way for men to connect with you?
The best way is my website. So my new website has just gone live in the last couple of days. So that's just joshconnolly.co.uk. It's all new there. So everything is there now. And they can find all my socials and everything that I'm up to and the work that I do can be linked through my website there. So that's the best way.
Very cool. Well, gentlemen, not to worry. We're going to have all the links in the show notes for Josh. All you have to do is head on over to thedadedge.com/Friday80. Again, thedadedge.com/Friday80. Josh, this has been awesome, man. Thank you so much for opening up your life, your childhood, marriage, parenting, the whole 9 yards, and just being your most authentic self, which has been a beautiful theme of this show.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You bet, my friend. Gentlemen, go out, live legendary, and change the game. Take care.